Good evening, a happy new year and a happy new month. Welcome to February and January once again. My name is Ezekiel Nathan Ohigu Uluwaseifumi. Welcome to the Nexus Podcast 100.1. Welcome to a new season on the Nexus Podcast, which is also working with the Redeemed Christian Church of God's team, New Beginning. And on this season of the Nexus Podcast, we'll be talking on knowing God. Welcome to today's episode of the Nexus Podcast, and the topic for today's episode of the Nexus Podcast will be Almighty God. Genesis chapter 17 verse 1 says, "And when Abraham was 99 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said to him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect." Almighty God is sufficient enough to meet all our needs and capable to do everything He desires to do. A name. A name represents the identity of the bearer. God's name had given to reveal Him to us and to help us have an understanding of who He is, what He can do in us and through us. Almighty means all wisdom, all knowledge, all authority, and all power. Almighty means El Shaddai. Abraham's encounter with the Almighty God brought a lot of blessings to his life, exceeding great multiplications, a new name, generational blessings. Conditions for the blessings of the Almighty: abiding in His presence, living a holy life. The Almighty God chooses to make Himself known to Abraham and gave him conditions that will bring him blessings, both to himself and generations after. Therefore, we as God's children are expected to walk in faith, patience, obedience, and integrity as instructed in His word. Man's effort and plan without God are futile. Absolute dependency on the Almighty God is important. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God. Therefore, our sufficiency only comes from God. That is it on the Nexus Podcast 100.1. Well, we're giving a copyright to the Directorate of Teens and Children Education, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, and the Directorate of Christian Education, the Redeemed Christian Church of God. It's been a long break, and we decided to just drop this, knowing God, with the first topic, Almighty God. Now that we have known who the Almighty God is, join us on the next series to know more about knowing God. My name is Ezekiel Nathan Ohiguluwashi for me, and this is the Nexus Podcast 100.1. We are open for feedbacks, corrections, and also suggestions, and also collaborations. See you next time.